Every single woman in existence can be likened unto a rose. Women are exactly as the rose, in fact. She climbs as she grows along fences, along walls, along trees that are already there, and as she fills them with this particular greenness through the spring, as eventually the fullness of warmth comes and summer arrives, she blooms in a certain resplendent beauty, brilliant whites, deep red, and a certain subtle pink begin to fill the side of any fence or any wall which is willing to bear her. And as with any living creature dwelling in that garden, she is unique in a certain way. There is no petal quite the same as any other. All of them arrayed in perhaps a similar certain pattern, but nothing that is entirely 100% the same. And in a sense this contributes a certain beauty in her own uniqueness. But often, many of these women behold the other roses, and they see that perhaps their flowers aren't quite so large yet, perhaps they haven't bloomed. Perhaps there are patches in her leaves where the slugs and snails and other insects dwelling in the garden have eaten away. Perhaps she laments to herself, why are these holes in my leaves? Why are my flowers not so brilliant and as large as this other rose? Perhaps she is completely ignored. Perhaps she has not even reached fullness of bloom in the midst of summer, and she wonders why, and she blames herself. I remember for a brief period in my life, perhaps 6 or 7 months ago, I met a woman a bit like this. Quite skinny, very quiet, and quite melancholic for no reason. She was this kind of girl who would just sit and read. And I think there was a certain sense in her that she didn't have the confidence, perhaps because the flower of her youth hadn't bloomed in the same way as those around her. She might not have had the physical beauty that brought in many of the men. She might not have had the vivacious personality that draws men in. But I saw something different in her. For when the gardener comes and judges the flowers that his rose has borne, he does not judge them necessarily on size. He doesn't judge them necessarily on the qualities of the individual petals, nor on the absence of the thorns, but he judges that plant for the sake of all of its faculties, all of the aspects of that being. And the fullness of that, in this case, was something very powerful, a very powerful interior beauty that shone out in spite of any failings that she might have seen within herself. And I think the thing with most women is that they forget that the gardener is not the visitor. The gardener waters, the gardener prunes, the gardener perhaps takes you out of the pot and plants you in the soil when you're ready. But the visitor doesn't. The visitor only perceives it. The visitor may well provide something to add on to you, but that is not where the fullness of life proceeds. And this is why so many women's relationships just burn out, because they mix up the gardener and the visitor. I may well have beheld the beauty of that woman at a certain point in my life, but I certainly didn't contribute anything to it. And likewise with all husbands and with all boyfriends. There is something to be gained, but it is not where growth proceeds from. There needs to be a constant remembrance of the gardener in all of this. And I think that as people mix up the visitor with the gardener, they put their trust in something that cannot truly provide life. And although a visitor is needed to behold the beauty of flowers, for what other reason are they planted, beyond the delight of the gardener and the visitor? It is important to remember where the life proceeds from, and I think that because of this forgetting of the gardener, many of the flowers become unkempt. And I'm sure some women who are watching this who don't quite follow my metaphor are probably asking themselves, well, why would I want to grow in accordance with the gardener? And frankly, it's because there are so many fruits to be gained from this that it would be very silly of you not to. One example of this, which may be a little bit hard to understand, is how Adam rejoiced when he saw Eve brought out of his ribcage. For Adam said, "This now is bone of my bones, and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man." And although you can't read the jubilation, and maybe you can't understand it, I can tell you as a man, having met many other men, and for myself, that that is a true spirit of jubilation. For when a man beholds a good woman, there is nothing but rejoicing. But this is kind of an abstract example. There were once two people called Olympia and John. John and Olympia were both celibate. They weren't married, they never had a relationship, but they were very, very close friends. And once, John was exiled from the town he lived in. He was beaten, he was dragged, and he was starved as he went through, but he kept in contact with Olympia, who frankly wept for the loss of her very dear friend. And although this was 1,600 years ago, we still have their letters, as John attempted through the written word to wipe away the tears of Olympia, who just lost one of her closest friends. The golden-tongued John, when talking to her about her depression, he provides this as a cure, as a balm. "Continually sing to your soul, and you will be able to scatter this dust. But since there is something else that particularly afflicts you, as I am aware, come and let us prepare a remedy for this thought, which we have spoken about earlier, and about which we will now speak further. For we know that you suffer not on account of these things only, but because you have been separated from our nothingness," referring to himself, "which causes you to weep continually, and to say to everyone, 'We no longer hear that voice of his. We no longer enjoy his teaching that we are so accustomed to. We are tortured by hunger, for that which God threatened to bring upon the Hebrews long ago. Now we are enduring. Not a famine of bread, neither of water, but a famine of divine instruction. But therefore, what shall we say about these things? That certainly it is possible for you in my absence to have fellowship with me through my books. And we will make haste, if we can locate couriers, to send you numerous long letters. But if you desire to hear my living voice, perhaps it is possible, and we will see each other again. God willing, or rather not perhaps, but surely, without a doubt. For now, I will remind you that I have not said these things rashly, neither have I beguiled you, nor made a miscalculation, but that you may hear my living voice through my letters. And you may well not know this, but I can say for certain, hand over heart, this channel is mostly a men's channel, that for every single tear shed in the absence of someone to love, from you, for every single pained thought of your own inadequacy, there is a man at the same time who desires to chant at the bottom of his heart, "O flesh of my flesh, O bones of my bones," to write that kind of thing to his beloved. But he doesn't know that woman, as you don't know that man. But take heart, for they are there. So often when I meet women who have allowed this loneliness to dominate them and to lead them into directions that destroy them ultimately. I have seen many women who jump from man to man seeking an emotional high. This emotional vampirism that ultimately comes from a distorted sense of this loneliness. And it destroys them utterly, and I would not wish that on a single one of you. And if any of you watching this know that you do this, stop it, please. Because all you're doing to yourself is taking the rose of your youth and plucking the petals from it slowly. And just as you grimace when you see a rose with its petals plucked out, men see a similar thing with a promiscuous woman. I can tell you myself, the strongest prefigurement of hell that I have ever seen in my entire life is looking on the eyes of a promiscuous woman that I have rejected. That strange mix of anger and lust, but also this deep sense of sorrow, this deep confusion, this lack of any idea of what to do, this unawareness of the remedy of their loneliness. For they have assumed, in their despondency and despair, that the only cure to this is through transient relationships that don't last, when that is in fact not the case. That is the route to wounding yourself. Now, if the sting of that does not persuade you to follow chastity, then consider what the results are when you do follow it. Now, I don't tell any women that I know this, and I'm not going to name the women who I've seen this in, but I've noticed in the women who keep sexual control of themselves, and the women who follow God's commandments, that they have a certain glow. They have a certain glow that transcends their own physical attributes, but it's still nonetheless there. Obviously, I'm not going to say this to them because they'll think I'm flirting, but it's a real thing. And there is no greater consolation you can offer to a man. As I'm sure many of you are shrieking at the screen as well, you don't always have to please men. There is room for not doing that, and I wouldn't want it any other way. But in the case where you don't want to please the visitor, you should please the gardener, he who planted you. You should please God by following his commandments. Because, just as I have said, they provide a certain inner beauty that a man can sense. They also please the person who planted you, the person who put you there for a reason, to shine in his garden. And with this, he will take pride in you and shower you with consolations. But if even against all reason you decide not to do this, you decide that you would rather just avoid that kind of thing and do your own thing and completely ignore both the gardener and the visitor, bear in mind that the gardener can always take you out of the garden. The choices have always been either varying degrees of love or varying degrees of death. And it frightens me as a man that many are choosing death. But I hope that these words find you with a contrite and meek heart, and that you may take them on board. For even if you haven't reached the fullness of your bloom, or your leaves are blighted, rest assured if you trust in the gardener, then the fullness of summer will come and you will bloom. Thank you very much for watching.